Good morning. Are we all there? Hello. So we start. Welcome to everybody, whoever is attending. I hope all of you are there to attend this lecture. Um, we'll start with module 2.2 and with Victorian poetry, Tennyson. But before that, I shall give you a short rundown on the age, the Victorian age, Victorian poetry, what were the elements that highlighted Victorian poetry and what really influenced the thoughts of the poets, not only the poets, but the literary figures. There's too many distances. Please do not disturb the class. Um, if you have questions or problems, you'll have to sort it out. When we talk of the Victorian age, first let's look at the background. The Victorian age was an age of seismic changes. We were, people in those days were coming up. It's ridiculous. Please do not send messages now during class. Do not send messages now. Stop all messages. Stop all messages. Do not WhatsApp during class, please. It disturbs the class. Please do not send messages. The Victorian era, which is spanning the duration of Queen Victoria's rule from 1837 to 1901, is characterized by the expanding of horizons of education, literacy, as well as by an increased desire of the people to question religion and politics. What's the problem? Do not send messages, please. Do not send messages. During this time period, publications such as Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, Darwin's Origin of the Species served as catalysts for political and religious controversy. We all know. Uh, First of all, look at the sentiments. It was all going very well. People had faith in the Christian beliefs of do not send messages on WhatsApp. Do not send messages on WhatsApp, please. If you've submitted your forms, relax. Listen to the class. These new notions of government and science signaled a turn from the idealism of the Romantics to a more empirical worldview. So the Victorian era also marks a time of great economic growth, technological discovery, technological inventions, industrialization. Many writers reacted to both the wonders of this revolution as well as to the troubles because it was a tremendous change. Everything was turned upside down. People's beliefs were questioned. An element of doubt came into people's mind. People's lifestyle changed. People's way of mentality, mindset changed. Also, during the Victorian era, the influence of literature became more prevalent in a society as reading evolved into a social pastime, indicated by the increasing literacy rate. More and more people were gaining literacy. Printing was there, hence the writers could share whatever they created. It was no more handwritten or hand copied reading material. Printing enabled the writers to share their creations to a wider audience. At the era's beginning in 1837, it is estimated that approximately half of the adult male population was literate to a certain degree at least. So while literacy increased, people could have more access to knowledge. People could know more about what was happening in the society, in the world, in England, that there was an industrial revolution happening, that the lifestyle would change, that their entire way of life would change. So that influenced the psyche of the people and most certainly the intellectuals. So, because of the new practices, compulsory education and technological advances in printing resulting in widely available reading material, standard literacy was more or less universal by the end of the century. That almost everybody at least had some level of literacy. As reading became less of a privilege of the wealthy, initially reading was only for the wealthy and the upper class. But then, by this point of time, it became more widely available, more. The reach was a lot better, and more of a pastime of the common English citizen. Publications such as periodicals flourished. So novels were serialized, people had more to read. They had access to more reading material, and magazines provided monthly installments of news articles, satiric essays, poetry, fiction. So these serial publications enabled many authors to easily share their work with the public and help launch the careers of prominent Victorian writers such as Dickens, George Eliot, Tennyson, and the Brownings, that is Robert and Elizabeth Barrett. Now, because literature was accessible and a pervasive part of Victorian society, studying it is crucial in understanding the attitudes and concerns of the people who lived during this era. Much of the writing during this time was a reaction to the rapidly changing notions of science, morality, society, because if you lose faith, obviously, whatever you held very close to your heart as morally high or morally sacrosanct. You at least you start questioning it. So Victorian writers also reacted to the writings of the previous generations, which was the Romantics. They probably wanted to escape what they saw as the excessive subjectivity of the Romantics, while at the same time keeping their individuality, originality, intensity very important, and above all, their sincerity. And this Victorian literature tries to combine the use of romantic subjectivity with the objectivity of the Augustans. That is one theory. The birth of the dramatic monologue and autobiographical fiction were used to bring personal experiences to literature without the author seeming self obsessed. The poetry, while the novel we know that was the dominant form of literature during the Victorian era, poets continued to experiment with style and methods of storytelling in their poems. Their sentiments came out, their imagery became richer. Examples of this experimentation include long narrative poems like epic poems and the dramatic monologue as seen primarily in the writings of Robert Browning, Tennyson, and for a majority of the Victorian age. Exemplified poetry of this era with his use of dramatic monologue, a more lyrical style, and a poetic voice that can be described as picturesque due to his use of description and mood creating imagery. Two other movements, the pre Raphaelites, which we'll come to later when we do Rossetti, and aestheticism and decadence movement, developed in relation to one another during the Victorian era. It was almost a reaction of one to the other. The first developed the first one developed when the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood wanted to create art for the modern age by practicing techniques of precision and simplicity in their written work. Pre-Raphaelites, they almost went back to the medieval age with their medieval painting, the world of medieval painting, in their precision, in their uh, control of depiction. The movement of aestheticism and decadence began again as a reaction to the Pre-Raphaelites. The members of this second movement believe, unlike the Pre-Raphaelites, Raphael was a painter from the Renaissance era, and Pre-Raphaelites was the Pre-Renaissance. That literature and poetry should be more reflective, more thoughts should be going into it, and this movement influenced poets such as Yeats and Hopkins, which is much later. And in religion, the Victorians experienced we will see when we do Tennyson, that they experienced a great age of doubt, the first that called into question institutional Christianity on such a large scale. Why? Because, well, when we do In Memoriam, we will see that Tennyson had finished In Memoriam and Darwin's discoveries or Darwin's theory started gaining ground much later. But in the fields of geology, that the world was not really created as described in the Genesis, but it was really created many years ago, many thousand years ago. And it was really, the earth really spun off as a part of the sun and was not really created by God in 6 days. And on the seventh day he rested. No. And he just didn't say that let there be light and there was light. That faith was there. But a lot of, please do not send messages. It really, really upsets the class and the flow. Do not send messages. Are we clear on this? Please do not send messages. They attempted to combine romantic emphasis upon self, emotion, and imagination with neoclassical ones upon the public role of art and the corollary responsibility of the artist. In ideology, politics, and society, the Victorians created astonishing innovation and change. Democracy, feminism, unionization of workers. So all the structures, the hierarchy was being questioned, was being restructured, was being there was a reorientation of thoughts, really. People were learning to rethink, reevaluate, question, express their doubts. Conflicts were created in their minds as to, was it really true, all that we have believed or held close to our heart through generations? Is it really true, or is there another angle, another dimension to this? In fact, this age of Darwin, Marx, and Freud appears to be not only the first that experienced modern problems, but also the first that attempted modern solutions. They were teaching people to think in another way. They were teaching people to regroup everything and restart in a new way. So, Victorian literature or Victorian era was a tremendous change both in the physical world and the intellectual and the psychological world. Can be taken to mean the parent of the modern. And like most powerful parents, it provoked a powerful reaction against itself. The moment you stir the pot, obviously, the bubbles become very big. And as John Stuart Mill said, that we are living in an age of transition. The more you see, it happened before in the Elizabethan era, when Elizabeth I was the queen, and expansion of the empire. People were traveling more. People started and the more prosperity comes into a kingdom, or more prosperity comes into a society, people start living a different kind of life. People are exposed to more things. People become aware of more things. That all that they knew was not all that exists or existed. Exists a wider world, a bigger world, more interesting things in life, a more interesting way of life. There are other people who believe and see things in another way. Hence the curiosity, hence the moving away of from faith that this is all that is there. No, there is more for me to explore. There is more for me to, I must go beyond the boundaries to explore more. That spirit of adventure comes in. At the same time, when you have ventured out, when you have got to know more than what you have known all these days, doubts come in. There's a conflict between faith and the new knowledge, faith in reality, faith in new knowledge. So the old, and of course, the period of transition, what happens? The old has passed away, but the new appears not in its stead. Obviously, the new takes time to take a form, to take a solid form, to take a defined form. Hence, there is always, it's like an earthquake. Everything is shaken, and then once it takes a lot of time to get steady, to get back on your feet, to stabilize, and to adapt oneself to the new way of life. So time is still in pangs of travail with the new, as Thomas Carlyle said. So now, when we come to poetry, John Stuart Mill said that poetry is feeling, confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. Let me just share this slide with you. Yes. Asking in the 1833 essay, What is Poetry? The philosopher John Stuart Mill said, Poetry is feeling, confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. Poetry is reflective. You have to look into yourself to express a new feeling. All poetry is of the nature of soliloquy. Really, a person is speaking to himself, analyzing what he feels, he or she, analyzing what he feels, analyzing and reflecting and commenting on what he feels. His inner sentiments are really pouring out into poetry. Whether it's the song of a nightingale, whether it's the flight of the skylark, whether it's a field of daffodils, whether it's the love for a beloved, whether it's the grief for the loss of a friend. It's all looking into yourself, what you're feeling, your pain, your pleasure, your happiness, your sadness, your loneliness. You are really bringing it out into the world, into words. But first, you have to look into yourself. You have to reach within yourself to see, to discover exactly what you want to see. Sometimes you can't even express exactly what you want. You kind of play around with words to say what you want to say. In the era's most heralded poetic innovation, Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning hybridized drama, fiction, and lyric into the dramatic monologue form. Monologue, one person talking, but presuming there is an audience. It's not really a soliloquy. And there is drama because there is a speaker and a listener. And there is intense drama in that particular moment when the speaker is speaking. Intense drama. There is very abrupt up and down. There are abrupt moments, there are decisive moments. So that is dramatic monologue. Particularly when we study Browning, we'll see that. So a poet impersonates a fictional or historical character and addresses a silent audience without any narrative framing of guide or guidance. Actually, it is in a dramatic monologue, the speaker is quite dismissive of the reactions of the other person. It is him, it is his moment, it is his feeling, it is his intensity of passion that takes the stage, that defines the moment. And it is he who takes action. And it is he who is creating the drama. It is he who is creating the beginning and the closure of the drama. His is the last word. Visually minded poets, including poet painter Dante Digi Rossetti and the writer designer William Morris, both associated with the pre Raphaelite Brotherhood, pushed poetry towards the picturesque. So, one part was dramatic monologue, the other part was the picturesque, relishing pictorial detail and painterly embellishments. And Swinburne, Tennyson, and Hopkins wrote lyrically lush poems that aspired towards music. We'll see when we study. And the sensory element was very important. The bird sings, the river or the brook flows, the leaves on the trees, they rustle, everything comes into it. It's really appealing to your senses. Let's come to Lord Tennyson, In Memoriam. Now, when we do In Memoriam, first, let's analyze. This is very simplistically put. It's a poem written in absolute intense grief at the loss of a very dear friend. But it's a poem written over 17 years. He wrote, and it was really almost like an emotional, spiritual journey of Tennyson from facing, from almost not being able to face the sudden death of his dear friend, who was supposed to become part of his family by marrying his sister, somebody he idolized, somebody he idealized, somebody who was his supporter, his colleague, his friend, a person who shared everything shared his ups and downs, mainly downs, was his tremendous supporter in his thoughts, his ideas, in his creativity, in his moments of sadness, moments, upsetting moments. Arthur Hallam was a tremendous support, was a very, very dear friend of Tennyson. Also, Hallam was everything that Tennyson was not. Hallam came from a very privileged background. He went to Eton, one of the most prestigious, expensive public schools in England. He had a he came from a wealthy background. He came from an educated background. He was he was from a very sophisticated, refined background. Everything that Tennyson was not. Tennyson came from a fairly impoverished background. His father was an alcoholic, dysfunctional family, too many brothers and sisters, always under financial pressure. He had to leave Cambridge to go back to take, when his father died, Cambridge, and he had to leave Cambridge and go back to take care of his family. And at that point of time, he was so low that some people even feared that he was going to lose his mental balance. And actually, mental mental illness existed in his family. Some of his siblings were mentally ill and suffered from depression and other kind of, in those days there were no defined illnesses as such, like syndromes and this and that, or personality disorder. People just called people mad. And some of his siblings actually suffered from mental illnesses or some sort of mental disorder. So he went into this, and he lived in a very cramped house with his siblings and mother, and there was always financial struggle. His creativity was constantly being disturbed, upset, suppressed, but he continued. The world of Hallam was something that Tennyson would love to be in. Hallam was almost like an oxygen cylinder for him, mentally, emotionally, and as far as his creativity was concerned. Hallam was a supporter. When Tennyson wrote, Hallam supported. Hallam wrote very positive reviews of his poetry. So, In Memoriam is a poem. Now, when he lost this friend, and that too at the absolutely young age of 22, it must have been a tremendous, incredible blow to Tennyson. And mind you, in those days, young people were far more emotionally vulnerable. They didn't really have that kind of psychological or emotional strength to say these things happen. So accepting a friend's death, a close friend's death at 22, must have been absolutely terrible for Tennyson. Must have shaken him, rocked his whole world, must have shattered him. And particularly, Hallam was supposed to have married. He was engaged to Tennyson's sister. So the shock, the grief, the sense of loss was so profound that it took him years to come to terms, as we see in the poem. It's a journey that today I'm devastated. And in the next part, we see it is, I'm a little more healed. And this is a process of healing, a process of acceptance, a process of coming to terms, a process of faith being shaken, a process of getting angry with nature, getting angry with the Lord, with God, getting angry, questioning whether there's really a heaven. Is there really a system, a divine system as such? If there is, why did they take my friend away at such a young age? So there is almost a revolt, an emotional revolt against everything divine, every kind of faith, everything that is held dear. All beliefs start crumbling. And then slowly out of that, he starts building his faith, he reconciles. And then there are too many changes in the world, in his world, in England, happening. So it was creating all kinds of inputs, and the inputs were creating confusions, the inputs were creating questions, inputs were creating doubt. Faith was on a very wobbly ground. But slowly things stabilize. And over the years, we see that he comes to term with the change, with the loss, and slowly it is almost like a process of emotional regeneration, that his friend is somewhere there. He accepts that he's not totally lost. He tries to find solace in the fact that there is a divine system. Although there are plenty of changes, the divine order, somewhere it exists, somewhere it is there. And we come to terms, we make peace with the ongoing changes and the existing order. We try to combine in our mind and try to find peace somewhere with ourselves and with the situation. It is an unusually sustained exercise in lyric verse. It's widely considered to be one of the greatest poems of the 19th century. The original title, as I see, was The Way of the Soul. It's like a journey. And this might give an idea of how the poem is an account of Tennyson's thoughts, emotions as he grieves over the death of a close friend. He views the cruelty of nature and mortality in light of materialist science and faith. Because there was industrialization, people were actually having access to a lot of material comfort and material convenience. In the beginning, like everybody else, his loss, it was a very raw wound. It was hurting. It was so raw. His emotions were so raw that he was thrashing around against everything, questioning the divine order, questioning whether all this change is needed. Why is this, what is happening? And then slowly the healing process begins. Slowly his faith is restored. Slowly his confidence is restored. And then he can see, we see that if we, as we analyze, we go along, we'll see that he's coming to terms with the change, he's coming to terms with the loss. He's almost accepting the fact, and he, in his mind, he's imagining that his friend hasn't really gone away totally. He's there everywhere, in nature, in his thoughts, in heaven, with somebody, with a, and this is all part of a greater plan, that his friend is taken away, yes, physically from the physical world, but in the spiritual world or in the heavenly world, he's somewhere there. He hasn't gone away. Owing to its length and its arguable breadth of it touches everything. The poet might not be thought as an elegy or a dirge in the strictest formal sense. It's a lot more than that. And we'll see a lot of critics say that he even records it. It's like they take the poetry, the poem is taken through a few Christmases, and we can see how Tennyson transcends. First, he's in his abysmal depth of grief. And then the next Christmas, first he's very sad, then he's calm, and then he becomes a bit not hopeful, but accepting. And then slowly he starts accepting. Towards the end, there is hope because his sister is getting married, and they'll probably see, a new generation coming up. There is a new generation, the birth of the children of his sister will, or even his own children, birth of the children of his sister would probably bring new hope, would probably restore faith in the divine order, in nature. and that everything that happens is part of a greater plan. So let's see a public and a private face, the one expressive of the loss of a sustaining culture and the other of personal loss. Victorian elegy. There is a lot of comparison, or there are opinions that In Memoriam is really almost like a pastoral elegy. Let's see first what a pastoral elegy is. The pastoral elegy is a poem. It has a Hellenic heritage, it has a Hellenic root in Greece and in Rome. It's a poem about both death and idyllic rural life. Now, why pastoral elegy is called, why is it pastoral? Because it's based in the rural life. In the rural life was in the olden days considered very ideal. Everything was pristine, unspoiled. People are happy with very little. The shepherd takes his flock out. He just plays on a pipe, sits under the tree, enjoys nature, clean air, green grass, blue sky. Everything is open. Nature is his best company. Everything is peaceful, quiet. There is no rush, no greed, no intense competition, no rivalry. He does his job. It's a simple life, pristine life. He does his job. He comes back home a peaceful man. Everything is very unspoilt. Often everything pastoral is very, our rural life was supposed to have been idyllic, clean, as opposed to city life, urban life, or yes, non-rural life. Often the pastoral elegy features shepherds. Jean is actually a subgroup of pastoral poetry, as the elegy takes the pastoral elements and relates them to expressing grief at a loss. So when you say elegy, elegy is really a poem of grief at the loss of a death of somebody. This form of poetry has several key features, including the invocation to the muse, expression of the shepherd's or poet's grief, praise of the deceased, that is the eulogy, a tirade against death, a detailing of the effects of the specific death upon nature, and eventually the poet's simultaneous acceptance of death's inevitability and hope for immortality. So, more or less, the form is the same that Tennyson says. First, he says he's really, absolutely shattered at the death of his friend. He is, he says how badly it will affect him and everybody else. The friend taken in prime, a person who was taken in his prime when he could do so much. It was actually believed that Hallam's friends believed that he could grow up to be a really great man, not only in the field of literature, but also in politics. His friend, his school friend, his classmate in Eton, I think, was Gladstone. And everybody believed that Hallam had tremendous possibilities, immense possibilities to become somebody really great. He was good at everything. He was good at debating. He was good at, he himself was a poet. He was good at literary criticism. He was good at poetry. He was popular among his friends. He was, he loved enjoying life. He traveled a lot. Actually, he died outside England and his body was brought in. He was, and he was only 22 years old. So losing a friend at the age of 22, Tennyson must have been at the same age when they were together in Cambridge. So losing a friend when you're in your early 20s or mid 20s is, they say that the friends that you make in schools and colleges become your best friend and they remain forever. They are best friends forever. So losing a friend at that age was a an unbelievable blow to Tennyson. Additional features sometimes found within pastoral elegies include a procession of mourners. So in the olden days, in the classical ages, it was all very ritualistic. Like you have a procession of mourners, somebody writes a pastoral elegy. S- the form was well described, well defined, and satirical digressions about different topics stemming from the death and symbolism through flowers, refrains, and rhetorical questions. The pastoral elegy is typically incredibly moving in its most classic form. It concerns itself with simple country figures because everything rural is simple and unspoiled. In ordinary pastoral poems, the shepherd is the poem's main character. In the elegies, the deceased is often recast as a shepherd, despite what his role may have been in life. Further, after being recast as a shepherd, the deceased is often surrounded by classical mythology figures such as nymphs and fauns. This is what used to happen in the olden days. Milton's Lycidas, considered the most famous pastoral elegy, mourns the death of the poet's good friend Edward King. In the 17th century, Donne, contemporary of Milton's, explored the genre further and addressed matters of human love, which to his metaphysically inclined mind often resemble death because you lose. He felt you fall in love, you lose almost, or you drown, kind of thing. Intensity. In Memoriam was intended as an elegy or a poem in memory and praise of one who has died. As such, it contains all the elements of a traditional pastoral elegy, such as Milton's Lycidas, including ceremonial mourning for the dead, praise of his virtues, consolation for his loss. Moreover, all statements by the speaker can be understood as personal statements by the poet himself. Like most elegies in Memoriam, the poem begins with expressions of sorrow and grief, followed by the poet's recollection of a happy past spent with the individual. Actually, it comes from within. It's all a very natural, very true to my heart kind of poem, creation. He is writing what he's feeling, the grief, intense grief of losing his friend. But because these poets were all highly groomed, well groomed in classical forms of poetry. So obviously those influences would manifest themselves in their writing. And this is also like elevating just a sad poem or a poem of loss or a poem of grief to the status of a classical pastoral elegy because he felt almost like his friend is as perennial, he's as enduring as something that belonged to the Hellenistic age. These fond recollections lead the poet to question the powers in the universe, obviously, that could allow a good person to die, which gives way to more general reflections on the meaning of life. Eventually, the poet's attitude shifts from grief to resignation, as we see. Finally, in the climax, he realizes that his friend is not lost forever, but survives in another higher form, which almost is like Tennyson is saying that which he deserves because he was so good, he was so much better than the ordinary people that we come across. The poem closes with a celebration of his transcendent survival. That the friend has transcended, he's gone beyond the mortal world and mortal and the material world. And now he has gone into the world of immortality, where he will live forever. Nobody can put a stop to his existence. Nobody can cut his existence short, as they can do in a mortal world. Everything perishes here, and nothing perishes in the world where he's gone. Then it ends with an epithalamion, which is a wedding poem celebrating the marriage of Tennyson's sister Cecilia to Edmund Lushington in 1842. The poet suggests that their marriage will lead to the birth of a child who will serve as a closer link between Tennyson's generation and the crowning race and the future. and it also represents new life, it's new life, regeneration after the death of Hallam, and hints at a greater cosmic purpose, which Tennyson vaguely describes as one far off divine event to which the whole creation moves. So he's really connecting the loss of a dear one, a dear friend, who was also supposed to marry his sister. The loss, he makes peace with, or he comes to terms with he says, finally I accept that he is gone. His body has been removed from us. Physically, he's been removed from us. But that whole going away was part of a divine plan, because the whole creation moves towards that someone perishes or something perishes, but something new comes across. Maybe it was for a greater cause. He tries to find some justification, some kind of some rationality in some rationale rather in what had happened to him. But like I said, it took him very, very long to do this. It took him 17 years to finish In Memoriam. It is really his journey from intense grief to a process of healing to finally coming to terms and a resignation to what really happens and is about to happen. Accepting that these things happen, will keep on happening, and new things will come out of the passing of the old. There is no avoiding it. There is no stopping it. There is no power actually that can interfere with the divine events that are designed by a higher being. The poem is also a deeply philosophical reflection on religion, science, and the promise of immortality. Tennyson was deeply troubled by the proliferation of scientific knowledge, which we talked about the origins of life and human progress. While he was writing this poem, Sir Charles Lyell published his Principles of Geology. I told you, changes that were, people were actually saying that the earth was not created in 6 days and the seventh day God was resting. So they undermined, they questioned, they almost challenged the biblical creation theory. And Robert Chambers published his early evolutionary tract, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. In Memoriam, Tennyson insisted that we hold fast to our faith in a higher power in spite of our inability to prove God's existence, believing where we cannot prove. We have to keep our belief, but we also have to take cognizance of the changes or the new discoveries that are happening. It doesn't really kill off our belief. Let it not kill off our faith. Man, through a process of lasting millions of years, is developing into something greater. In the end, he's almost saying that that is also a divine ordering. That is all God's plan. Even if we've discovered evolution now, that is also God's plan. And that the soul, or the human soul, human beings and their soul and their mind, they carry on. They don't die off. They carry on. And thereby he achieves a synthesis between his profound religious faith and new scientific ideas of his day. Like I said, that this whole process is a healing process. He's wallowing in grief. He's drowning in grief. Then he slowly starts healing. Then he slowly starts accepting. Then he slowly starts coming to terms with what has happened and what is happening around him. So his private grief or his private feelings, reflections, and as well as his taking cognizance of what is happening in the public life, he comes to terms with both of these. He combines both of these, he synthesizes. So, at the same time, his profound religious faith and the new scientific ideas of the day, he puts them together. He accepts and he says that one can only survive and continue to survive if these two can be synthesized. By rejecting one for the other, or by dismissing, or by not believing, will not achieve anything. Simply because it will leave the mind and the soul in the same turmoil that we started off with. So, alongside his personal grief, Tennyson also gives voice to the consciousness of Victorian society. Searching for the meaning of life, because the Victorian society, like we said, because of too many changes, the consciousness of the Victorian society, men and women, it all became very badly ruffled. Too many inputs coming from too many angles. People didn't know what was true, what to accept, how far should they accept, and how far should they renounce. Should they move away completely from religion? Should they turn their back totally on God and say, this is the age of reason? There is no God, there is no nothing, no spirit, no holy, no heaven, no hell. I do what I do, I exist for today, and when it's over, it's over. Or should I still believe that there is a divine design, there is a divine power which guides us, which helps us in our moments of grief, in our moments of loss? Or should we at all turn to them? He often falls back on facts as a method to keep his writing going. There's an essay, Astronomy and Geology, Terrible Muses, Tennyson in 19th Century Science. A.J. Meadows explores Tennyson's intense. He loved studying science. He was a very erudite person, Tennyson. Noting that it existed from early in his life, Meadows explains that Tennyson struggling to cope, actually, all of the writers that we will be studying, Browning, Christina Rossetti, all these people, they were very, very well read. They were quite well equipped. They exposed themselves to different theories, different paths, different knowledges, different kinds of knowledge, different inputs of knowledge from different sources. Some created a bit of unrest within their minds and souls. Some helped strengthen their faith and their convictions. So he struggled to cope with his personal problems, set himself a rigorous program of study mostly devoted to science. This reflects in the writing of In Memoriam as Tennyson addresses the relationship between science and religion, reflecting the existential hesitations of his contemporaries. Obviously, people they'll question their own existence, they'll question their own coming into this world. That if I'm not part of a divine design, divine order, what am I? What is the value of my existence? The personal struggle is still apparent. However, the external prevails over the internal in these sections as the focus falls on the more universal contemplations and public debates. Tennyson's interest in human progress is not limited to scientific discoveries only. There's a profound interest in spiritual progress as well. He constantly explores the human spirit, its journey, how it is nurtured, or does it get nurtured by scientific discovery, or is it hampering the progress of the soul? With many references to God and the biblical creation of the human, who has the likest God within the soul. because the human soul, it is believed, is semi-divine because it has the sometimes it has some messages or some sensing of it is part of the immortal. So religion and science are at first contradictory, of course. The opposition between science and religion is introduced as a strife, a struggle, a conflict between God and nature, where the latter is portrayed as careless of the single life, Tennyson says, because nature can take away a life like that very easily. It is clear that Tennyson's personal feelings influence his judgment. Since Hallam died unexpectedly, it is no surprise that Tennyson does not accept the randomness and carelessness of nature. He, in fact, tries to rebel against it. He questions, he lashes out at it. He continues to contemplate the meaning of life, expressing his hopes for a higher order, for a power bigger than himself. So he obviously had very strong faith in the higher order, in the divine design. And maybe he turns to it to sustain himself through his hours of conflict, spiritual conflict. There is a change of tone towards the close of the poem. The strong feelings of grief, despair, and doubt have been replaced by acceptance and hope. Just as there is harmony between God and nature, as they are represented as a whole, there is harmony within the self. It has to happen because time heals. Time also helps you see things. Like we say, over time, we reflect, we analyze, we come to terms with things. We see things from different angles. This part of the poem represents the calm after the storm, where the individual, after going through a surge of emotions and existential contemplations, has embraced their faith and believes that their dear heavenly friend lives inside them, which most people do after a loss, after the sense of intense grief. They sometimes find solace in the fact that he lives on in our heart through their thoughts and in their words. The major difference is that the poet's search is at last fruitful. For the poem ends with the words, I take the pressure of thine hand. After much thought, Tennyson has finally managed to accept his grief by substituting it for love. Tennyson's private resolutions and the achieved content are merged at the end with exterior happiness. And it ends with the happy hour of a wedding. And as he says himself, in the poem altogether, private grief swells out into thought of hope for the whole world. It is a very impersonal poem as well as very personal. It's a general reflection. At the same time, it comes from his entire soul. It comes from his own heart. We will we'll pause here a little bit and go back to one second. Let's go back to the thing. Reflect a little bit on Tennyson as, or rather the poem itself, as a pastoral elegy. It is often said that Tennyson himself is not always the speaker, the author speaking of himself, but the voice of the human race speaking through him. So it's an account of the poet's own experience, but designed so as to be the voice of the human race. So it is sometimes, as we said, it is very impersonal as well as personal. He's actually voicing the doubts, the anguish, the angst of the public as the public itself was going through the general public was going through the disturbance that was caused the upsetting element of that change was bringing, and he generalizes his feelings referring to other people in similar situations, or what happens when there is an abrupt change in your life through a death, through a loss, through anything that upsets your life. So he compares himself to young people who have lost their lovers, to parents who have lost their children, to widows, to widowers. He tries to generalize loss. He says, although he himself was he was drowning in his own grief, he slowly opens out as his search for an assurance of Hallam's immortality, leading him to larger issues like the problem of life after death, contact between the dead and the living, the future of mankind, and God's attitude to his creation. At the end of In Memoriam, his attention is turned to the feud of rich and poor, ancient forms of party strife, false pride in place and blood, civic slander and the spite. It is possible to suggest in the end that this duality does not imply any contradiction as such. The same dichotomy can be seen in Matthew Arnold, and one critic, D.G. James, has argued that the impulse towards the classical is another factor. This is romantic yearning. The classical becomes only a symbol for the unavoidable thing. The other, unattainable, transcendent, and is edited into a symbol only by a certain play of self deception and by a refusal to face historic realities. Now, this poem has fragments of an elegy but must have rejected the title because of its suggestion of a lack of unity in design. Though written over a long period of time, the poem in its finished form does not appear intermittent in character. There is one thread that holds all these sections together, is his sense of grief, his coming to terms, and his making peace. And of course, immortalizing his friend through his poem. As Charles Tennyson says in his biography of the poet, that he never contemplated weaving them into a whole or publishing them until he found how many he had written, but had jotted them down as they occurred to him, wherever he happened to be. There could have been a lack of continuity due to the desultory way in which it was written in bits and pieces and it was composed, and follows Tennyson's own practice of referring to it as the elegies, as a bunch of elegies. Those elegies on Hallam, it was often spoken of, those elegies, as if it's a bunch of elegies on Hallam. But many later critics sought to deny the poem's intermittent nature and demonstrate its organic unity, achieved through a skillful organization of symbols, themes, and imagery. Thus, we sometimes get, particularly a critic called Robert Langbaum, he says that the concept of the dynamic unity, a moving unity in memoriam of thought and feeling dependent on a dialectical principle of growth of a single consciousness, and I would say the evolution of the consciousness. He detects two main themes which give texture to the poem: the theme of reciprocal death, and sometimes there is an erotic theme of touching. The erotic theme gradually leads to the idea of rebirth, which culminates in the vision of Hallam as a link between today's man and the crowning race of the future. Langbaum's emphasis on the erotic theme seems appropriate if you remember that Tennyson spoke of his poem as a kind of divine comedy, beginning with a death and ending with a marriage, suggesting thereby that love is its most significant thing. The love for his friend, the love for his what they shared really, intellectually, personally, was it keeps the whole poem together. Throughout the poem, there is one note that rings out loud. That is the love for his friend, the loss of his friend, the grief he feels at the loss of his friend. And as I said, that at the age of 22, or when one is in one's 20s, the emotions run very high. The feelings are very intense. There is no level of indifference that creeps into someone's mind and says, "Oh, these things can happen. You have to accept it." A man at 22 finds it very difficult. um, Very difficult to accept the loss of his buddy, of his friend. Because everything you do together. You go out together, you write poetry together, you are spending time together always. The bond is extremely strong when you are young. It is not like friendship you made at work or friendship you made later at life. When you kind of detach, there is some element of detachment when one becomes mature because one has to lead his own life. But in the late teens and early 20s, you do everything together. Everything together. You go out together, you go through highs and lows together, you go through heartbreaks together. So it's all, and you share so much. It was almost like Tennyson had lost another half of himself. A part of him, it was almost like a part of him had died. Yes. So Eliot often said that in memoriam has the unity and continuity of a diary, a journal, because of because it was written over so many years. It's almost like reading a diary, how he changes, how he is confessing himself, how his mind changes. His mind goes through a change through the healing process, how he records his feelings, how he it's almost like a journal. We can see the change happening over 2 decades almost. The three Christmases marks the divisions of the poem. But Tennyson himself also maintained that the poem has 9 divisions. Perhaps the best way of realizing the unity of the poem is that adopted by a critic called Sinfield, who says that there is no need of divisions. The movement from grief to acceptance is not smooth and regular. It's not mechanical, but then neither is life. It depends on how one privately deals with one's grief. Some might take a year, some might take 10 years, some might take 17 years, like Tennyson did. So, Coleridge's concept of organic unity, after all, emphasizes the growth from within. So, you grow, you mature from within. comes from maturity. Coming to terms comes from maturity. The governing factor in the poem is the rise and fall in the poet's feelings, like the rise and fall of waves. In fact, he uses this metaphor himself when he compares the movement of his grief to the tide of the river Wye, and it proceeds in waves. A subject is taken up, gathers to a head, breaks in a climax, and then sinks back again, though occasionally a heavy swell comes unexpectedly. The form of in memoriam recreates the shapes of the life of the emotions. There is also, I'm teaching from text, so I don't always have slides. Sometimes I show slides. In the poem, many occasions and experiences which form a pattern of reduplication, such as Christmas, spring, the anniversaries of Hallam's death, and the visits to the yew tree. To take one example of the process, the yew tree, with its roots in the graveyard below, is unchanged by the seasons which bring the flower again, and therefore symbolizes the poet's total absorption in his grief. However, he visits the tree again in spring and realizes that it angers the golden hour. And then the poet visits the dark house of his dead friend, feeling his emptiness, while far away the noise of life begins again. And ghastly through the drizzling rain, on the bald street breaks the blank day. He can think only of a hand that can be clasped no more. Also, the contradiction in the situation, how conflicting is the situation, that in nature everything stays. The yew tree stays, the river flows, seasons change, but things remain. Things change with the change of time. But my friend has been taken away. Human life is, it's so transitory, it's so non-permanent. It's only my friend who will not be there, whom I'll never see again. These flowers will bloom, the yew tree will change colors, the sky will become blue, dark, storms will be there, they'll be calm, except that I will never have my friend back again. We will now move on to part of, uh, we'll do part Robert Browning. Now, when we think of Robert Browning himself came from a very educated background. His father had a collection, a massive collection of 6,000 books. He built up a library of 6,000 books, and Browning actually loved, he wanted to be a playwright, but he wasn't very successful as a playwright. Since he had mastery on writing scripts or dialogues for a play or dramatizing situations, his poetry became, the element of drama was very strong in his poetry. And he became a master of the dramatic monologue and made him one of the foremost Victorian poets. And the poems are known for their irony, characterizations, dark humor, social commentary, historical settings, and challenging vocabulary and syntax. So let's first take a look at his career first. That his early career began promisingly but collapsed. The long poems Pauline and Paracelsus received some acclaim, but the difficult Sordello in 1840, which was seen as a willfully obscure, brought his poetry into disrepute. His reputation took more than a decade to recover, during which time he moved away from Shelleyan forms of his early period and developed a more personal style. And then, of course, he was in correspondence with Elizabeth Barrett, who was controlled by, by a very oppressive father. And then they had to elope to live in Italy to marry. And he was a very devoted husband. We'll just take a 5 minute break, just give my voice a little bit of rest and come back. Right. So we'll just share again. Share screen. So we'll go into dramatic monologue a little later. First, let's just have a look at Browning's life. He was born on in May 1812 in Camberwell, a suburb of London. He and a younger sister, Sariana. His mother's name was Sarah and Anna together. And so Sariana was Browning's younger sister. And his father was a bank clerk, and he had assembled a large library of 6,000 books, which formed the foundation of Robert Browning, the poet's unconventional education. The family was devoted to his being a poet, supporting him financially, which he was very lucky, financial and public financial support, as well as moral support. So his early works were published. They helped, the parents helped. And Robert Browning's Paracelsus, published in 35, received good reviews. But critics disliked Sordello, published in 1840, because they found its references to be obscure. Browning enjoyed being obscure. He didn't, if you read his poems, you'll see he speaks, he would like to say things. For example, when you go through the poem My Last Duchess, all he says is, I gave a command and all smiles stopped. He didn't have to say that I hated the fact that my Duchess was too friendly or too flirtatious with everybody, or it's the fact that she paid attention to everybody, not only to me. Hence, I decided that I would not allow that. Hence, I decided that she must be killed. Not. Very succinct. Just 4 words, 5 words. So I gave my commands, and all smiles stopped. It was over and done with. With that, he's almost, his attitude is almost dismissive. That it was nothing that important. I just thought she was going too far, and the best way to stop that was to get rid of her for good. That she wouldn't smile anymore. And what's the best way to stop her from smiling? Is to kill her or freeze her smile for good in a painting, which only I reveal, only I move the curtain. And she doesn't smile at anybody anytime she wishes. It is not her wish, it's my wish. So he didn't like to be too revealing or too many words or too verbose in anything. So that is also one of the main features of, if even if you take the two terms, dramatic monologue, that is where the drama is, that is where the intensity is, the abruptness, the the fact that he was being very, he was almost being non-generous with his expressions in words. The economy of expression, that was very important. That is also part of drama. It's also, it's almost like a mixture of words and gesture. That I gave commands and all smiled. It's almost a visual experience. That he nods his head, and the Duchess was killed and she didn't smile anymore. That's it. To ensure that she only smiles at me or only looks at me, I just had to raise a finger or tip my hand and say, just finish her off. That's all. Anyway, so Browning lived with his parents and sister until 1846, when he married the other poet, and a very, very well-known poet, Elizabeth Barrett, an admirer of his writing. They actually started corresponding over his work, and she fell in love with his work as well as the man himself. And Elizabeth Barrett was quite unwell. She had serious health issues, but Browning was so close to her. He got very attached to her, and they eloped and married, and they settled in Florence, Italy. Florence, of course, is the place for art and culture in Italy. Everything artistic is called Florentine almost. He wrote very little. They had a son whom Browning educated, and lived on an inheritance. Well, this is Elizabeth's cousin's inheritance, and she died quite. I mean, not very early, but she died well before Browning, and it affected him quite badly because he was very attached to his wife, not only personally, emotionally, but also intellectually. And actually, he started getting recognition when he was well into his 50s. And in the 1860s, he published his Dramatis Personae, which had both had a first and second edition. And one of his biggest successes was the children's poem. I think all of us have read it at some point, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, and and it was published in 1842. The poem was not one that Brown deemed consequential. However, it is one of his most famous. Now we see that he secured his place as a prominent poet with his what he's most well known for, his dramatic monologue, the form he mastered and for which he became known and influential. So a character in a dramatic monologue, character speaks to a listener from his or her subjective point of view. In doing so, the character often reveals insights about himself or herself, often more than intended. We'll see it in My Last Duchess. While Robert Browning's work was disparaged by many in the early 20th century modernist poets, but the mid century critics asserted the importance of his work. In his more advanced years, Browning became widely respected, and there was a Victorian public appreciated the hopeful tone of his. He has his the there was always a positive tone in his. He wanted to make, when we deal with The Last Ride Together, he wanted to make the best of the situation. And even in his, so to speak, sinister poems, you will see that the speaker is speaking almost as if there's nothing very negative about what I've really done. In My Last Duchess, the guy's he's a murderer, and he says, well, I have murdered her, yes, but that was necessary, really, because she was crossing the boundaries too often. And now let's talk about my next marriage, in which I'll get a lot of dowry, hopefully, and you are the emissary. I have revealed to you. I have nothing to hide. Yes, I said that I had a very flirtatious wife, my last duchess, so I had to put an end to her life. That's not a big deal, really. Sometimes things have to be done. What has to be done has to be done to suit the situation. And now let's move on to the next situation. Robert Brown. Now let's one more time look at the form dramatic monologue. A persona poem, or what is popularly termed as a dramatic monologue in poetry, uses the theatrical device of a monologue. So there is a very theatrical element. There is a performance part in it. The person speaking, somebody listening. It's almost like a person is standing on a stage under a single focus and he speaks alone. But through his speech, a very dramatic moment, a very theatrical situation is created, often done to highlight the character or author's internal thoughts and vocalize, and it can be very visual. Through one person's words, an entire scene is created, an entire situation is created, an entire reaction is created. Action and reaction is created. The author's internal thoughts are vocalized to an implied audience. It was used in poetry in the 20th century, and romantic poetry was seen as the root of the same because it's quite subjective sometimes. Most of the times, dramatic monologue, of course, it's one person speaking, so it's his feelings, his passions, his emotions that are coming to the fore. It is usually one person's speech to oneself or the audience, reader, wherein he talks about a subjective view on a situation, topic, or any other character. Browning was the poet who perfected the use of dramatic monologue in his poems like My Last Duchess, Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister. His use of the device influenced Eliot and other modernist writers. His critical reputation rests mainly on his dramatic monologues, in which the words not only convey setting and action, but reveal the speaker's character. Unlike a soliloquy, the meaning is not what the speaker voluntarily reveals, but what he inadvertently gives away, usually while rationalizing past actions or special pleading his case, special or a special pleading of his case to a silent auditor, silent listener. Remember, we do not get a reply or a response. It is taken for granted that what I am saying, whatever I'm expressing, you are listening to it and you're accepting it. You're accepting my point of view. That there is logic in it. There is sound logic in it. My point of view is very logical, very correct. There is no scope for argument. There is no scope for any contradiction. These are the dramatic monologues are paradigm cases of the monologue form. One such example used by teachers to satirization or of the sadistic attitude in his soliloquies, or even if the in My Last Duchess, you will see that there is he looks upon his wife, his last duchess, although she herself came from a very from an illustrious background. But he thinks that the Duke thinks that I belong to a superior echelon. Hence, what I did is justified. Nobody questions it. Nobody has the right to question. There should be no questioning of it. Mind you, Browning gave up his playwright's career to write poetry because a lot of the critics encouraged him to stay with poetry. And his failed dramas actually helped him hone his skills as the writer or as a producer of the dramatic monologues. Because poetry is one thing, very lyrical, very nice, love to read. There's a lot of melody in it, there is music in it, there are thoughts in it, there is intensity in it. There is, I mean, whether you're addressing a skylark, whether you're addressing a nightingale, whether you're writing an ode on a Grecian urn, whether you are writing sonnets to a friend, all that's very nice. You're really talking to somebody, expressing your thoughts. But creating drama, creating a theatrical moment, creating that level of intensity of a decisive moment, decisive dramatic moment, that is what the dramatic monologue so famous for, so powerful. It's a lot more powerful than describing the song of a nightingale or the intensity, the it's like be going through a play. It's like sitting through a play. It's like experiencing an entire scene, which there's one speaker creates. When you read Porphyria's Lover, there's this one speaker who is describing that there's a stormy night when glided in Porphyria. And she comes and she bears her shoulder and she tries to kind of seduce me. And what do? I freeze this moment simply by strangling her with her beautiful golden hair. And she stays forever slouched on my shoulder. This will never change. This situation, this particular moment will never change, will never become something else. This stormy night, the storm in our hearts, the storm of our passion, of our feelings, this is frozen in this one moment when I have strangled her. As far as I'm concerned, this frame is frozen. That it'll never change her golden hair, her golden locks, her incredibly seductive looks, her incredibly attractive wet clothes, dripping hair, rosy lips, nothing will change. She will remain the beautiful Porphyria, golden haired Porphyria, who has been frozen in this frame. It's almost like I have created a work of art from a living body. She's become sculptured or painted, captured in this one moment. So that is what the drama, and it's almost like this is the most natural thing to do. That my feelings for her are so intense that I couldn't let go of this one intense moment, one moment of passion, one moment of love, that I have to freeze her in a frame, keep her like this forever. Basically, it's action in character, not character in action. Like I was giving you examples of Porphyria's lover, Last Duchess, Love Among the Ruins, The Last Ride Together. A dramatic monologue typically features an incandescent, extremely passionate moment of, or emotional moment of crisis or self realization. The man who's speaking, his realization is totally subjective. I mean, somebody else would call him mad. That this is the woman, is a beautiful golden haired woman who's walked into your house on a stormy night and she's looking so desirable. She's looking so beautiful, so desirable, so attractive. You could eternalize it into a night of love. But this man's rationale is totally different. His reasoning is totally different. He says, in order to make this eternal, I kill her. So that in my life, and God hasn't said a word, which means there is no approval, no disapproval. What I have done is right. There's a sense of entitlement. But the way the speaker says it, you almost agree with him that there could be no better way of eternalizing this moment. Or when we talk of the last Duchess, you almost tend to agree with the Duke. You call him a monster. You realize that he's been a monster. He's killed his wife so that she didn't smile at anybody else. But somewhere down the line, the way the speaker speaks, the monologue is delivered, the speaker is almost convinced, and he's almost managed to convince the listener that, look, this was the best route I could take. And you better agree with me. Wouldn't you agree that if you didn't want your wife to be flirtatious, he calls it flirtatious. She was probably just smiling in an innocent smile at everybody. She was just being nice and polite. But he felt his point of view was, why should my wife, whom I gave so many generations of name and fame, not fame, name, that I come from an illustrious background, a traditional background. She didn't value that. She thought she was slighting. He felt that she was slighting, trivializing my heritage by smiling at the common people, everybody. To stop that, I had to kill her. Yes, of course, I've immortalized her. Look, she's in this painting. She's been painted by a very famous painter, but she's hidden like something very precious. whom only I can, the curtain can be removed only by me. She can be revealed only by me, and I'm so special. I'm the owner, I'm the proud owner. It's like a piece of jewel, very, very precious gem, which is revealed or uncovered at very special moments, unveiled at a very special moment by a very special person, not for everybody to enjoy, not for the masses. It's very exclusive. I have killed her, I have painted her, made her eternal, made her retained her youth, her smile, her colors in a painting by a master painter. And I have afforded her that exclusivity which she did not realize. She did not realize the exclusivity of my heritage. She was mingling with the riffraff. To retain her exclusivity, I had to kill her, put her in a painting, cover her, and made sure that she would be exclusively revealed or unveiled only by someone as important as me, not to be seen by everybody. So the action in character, not character in action, rather like a soliloquy, except in being addressed to a present but silent listener. It is not an ode. It is not an elegy. Nothing of the sort. You are talking to somebody. This type of poem enabled Browning to let his speakers' personalities, motives, and from that one speaker's speech, we get a profound insight into the personality of the speaker. Think of the Duke of the Last Duchess. Think of the boyfriend, the lover of Porphyria. The level of their obsessions, the delusions are revealed, inadvertently or otherwise. Definitely, I doubt if it's, well, for the character himself who's speaking, he doesn't know that he's revealing so many dimensions of his character. But I think the poet knows that he's revealing the Duke as a self-obsessed monster who doesn't think, doesn't bat an eyelid before he thinks of killing his wife. Yes, she's lost her life, but what has she gained? She's gained exclusivity in speech and implied gesture. And it is said when Porphyria's lover kills Porphyria, it's done so lovingly that she puts her head on my shoulder, she comes, she snuggles up to me, and I just thought, what a fabulous moment. Why don't I make it forever by killing her? She stays on my shoulder with her head on on my shoulder, her shoulder half revealed, half her body half revealed. Could have been a moment of intense passion. But what better way to make this a forever moment than killing her? In the same way, she will die like this, not as an old woman, not looking haggard, not moved out of or finished, spent with her passions, nothing of the sort. In this particular moment of passion, she stays frozen, forever in love with me, forever an object of desire, of my desire. So, this preoccupation with inward psychological drama, which springs of action rather than with action itself, is the origin of Browning's greatness as a poet, of his limitations as a stage worthy playwright. He couldn't make it on the stage, but he brought drama into his poetry. The same dialogue that he would have given to a guy when he kills is immortalized in a monologue. We'll just see, analyze, Let's take a look at Last Ride Together. It's a monologue of a rejected. Now, you see, we talk about Browning's optimism. The Last Ride Together is the monologue, again, the rejected lover that expresses his undying love for his beloved. So now the lady love has gone, well, whether she's going to marry somebody else or going for somebody else, we don't know. But the poem, this entire concept of living in the moment, carpe diem, live for the moment, seizing the present, is again there. The rejected lover that expresses his undying love for his beloved. He says, my feelings are undying. They'll never go away. My feelings for you will never go away. The dramatic situation appears to be one in which the lover, upon being rejected by his mistress, asks for, and is granted, one last horseback ride with her across a mysterious landscape. And the ride, however, seems to stretch out to eternity. There is no sense of time demarcation, but a continuous unfurling of landscape that goes on and on and on. The poem echoes although it could be a very short ride, but he keeps describing, his own feelings are that through this last ride, I am again eternalizing this final ride, I am eternalizing our togetherness. And he dwells upon the significance of the present as he continues on the ride, concentrates on the ride. Why people, and he keeps asking, why do people attach so much significance to the past and the future than focusing on the present? His soul, that was hitherto a long stramped scroll, smoothens itself out. The metaphor connotes living life to the fullest in elation and ecstasy for the moment, which also happens in another way, in Porphyria's lover. The scroll freshens and flutters in the wind in intense euphoria. Why does one get carried away by past actions? And he says, had I said that, had I done this, so might I gain, so might I miss. Who knows? Who knows if I had done this, this would have happened. We don't know what would have happened if I didn't do this or I did do that. But right now, I have this horseback ride, this companionship of my beloved. Right now, there is no room for doubt. There is no room for them. I might have suspected her of being unfaithful. I might have had doubts about her. I might have wallowed in self pity for my failures. I might have had misgivings that might have haunted me. But let those things not distract the present. One should breathe each moment as though there is no room for regret. This particular poem, The Last Ride Together, makes profound statements concerning the irrelevance of the past in relation to the present emotions and sentiments. More specifically, he discusses hopes that have not been fulfilled, places them in direct contrast to the present circumstances. He said, this is more than what I would have hoped for. That the fact that she has said yes, okay, I shall give you company, I'll go for a ride with you in the countryside. By revealing the idea that sentiments and events of the past often have little effect on future outcomes, Browning suggests that life should not involve dwelling on the past or hoping for the future, because we don't even know. The next moment one can be dead. So live the moment, carpe diem, and enjoy what you have right now. That is his philosophy. Also, he he tries to sound very positive that find keep finding hope at the good thing, within the good thing that is happening to you right now. As he rides with his beloved, continues to think about the world, he says that brain and hand cannot go together hand in hand. Conception and execution can never be paired together, simply because man is not able to make peace with his or keep pace with his actions to match with his ambitions. He plans a lot, achieves a little. The lover feels that he has at least achieved a little success by being able to ride with his beloved. He compares himself with a statesman and a soldier. He says a statesman works hard all his life, but all his efforts are merely published in a book or as an obituary in newspapers when he goes. Similarly, a soldier dies fighting for his country and is buried in the Westminster Abbey, which is his only reward for after death. But he's gone, he's died. What is his achievement? What has he enjoyed? He could have died at the age of 22, 23, 24, 30. He didn't even know when death struck him what unfulfilled ambitions, wishes he's left behind. Sometimes an epitaph is raised in his memory, but that is all. But then the lover compares himself with that of a poet, himself, his lot with that of a poet. He believes that a poet's reward is too small compared with his skills. The poet might have composed beautiful lyrics, thoughts or emotions of others, views that men should achieve beautiful things in life, but the reward in return is very little, and he dies in poverty in the prime of his life. Keats did, actually. Many poets died very young. Compared to the poet, the lover considers himself luckier. He has at least achieved the consolation of riding with his lover for the last time. The lover thinks that it would be a heaven on earth for him if he continues to ride with his beloved forever. He wishes that the moment should become everlasting so that they could continue to ride together forever and ever. That would indeed be heavenly bliss for him. Thus, through this poem, Browning expresses the view that the past, of course, we've seen is insignificant. And the thing is, you can change nothing about the past. What has happened has happened. There is no editing of the past. There is no reordering of the past. There is no re editing of the past. Because life cannot be a let's do a trial run and let's see if it works. And then we can correct. So in life, there is no trial run. What has happened already. But right now, you have this moment. Pursue happiness in the moment. Life is a long journey that is best played out with a special love. Seeing every day as one's last can really put a. This is a very repeatedly occurring sentiment in many poetry. I mean, you even see it in Shakespeare's sonnets. You even see it in many poets, poetical works or literary works that live for the moment simply because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or in the next few minutes. So there is in as far as imagery is concerned, there is juxtapositions of city in ruins, hopeful love on a last ride together. Both illustrate this idea dramatically. One can learn not to look back on what one hoped for, but only to look forward at what one has. Or enjoy the moment that one has. You just enjoy the moment that you've been blessed with right now. So Browning's optimism shines through in the last ride together. He sounds very positive that I have managed to win this moment. I cannot change my past. I cannot design my future. Very difficult because I don't even know. I might design, but it may not. Design might just crumble, might just collapse. But right now, at this moment, I am alive. I'm having a last horseback ride together with my beloved, who will never have anything to do with me. So which is part of my future that I will not have her in my future. But I don't want to think about it and make myself miserable over that. And also I do not want to moan over what I have not been able to fulfill. That I've had misgivings, that I've had doubts, that I've had probably betrayals, probably rejections also in the past. So he doesn't want to waste his time looking at the past or hoping for the future or despairing at the future that this will not happen ever again. But now I have this pleasure of the last ride together. Let me enjoy it and let me be thankful for it. There is nothing wrong. Let's take a look at my Last Duchess. It was published in 1842 and it's arguably Browning's most famous dramatic monologue with good reason. It engages the reader on a number of levels: historical, psychological, ironic, theatrical, and more. The most engaging element of the moment is probably the speaker himself, the Duke. He's a killer. Objectively, it's easy to identify him as a monster, since he had his wife murdered for what comes across as fairly innocuous crimes. Nobody would kill a wife just because she's smiling at somebody else. And yet, he's impressively charming. Like I said, that most of the speakers in the dramatic monologues, you feel that they can actually charm the listener or the reader into sharing his point of view, empathizing with him. They can almost charm the listener or the reader into feeling the same way or agreeing to his logic, both in his use of language and his affable address. The ironic disconnect that colors most of Browning's monologues is particularly strong here. A remarkably amoral man, nevertheless, has a lovely sense of beauty and how to engage his listener. So, the Duke's excessive demand for control ultimately comes across as his most defining characteristic. What is it? It's almost a narcissistic desire for control. That my wife is really a commodity, is a possession that I have. And I must not share her, certainly not her smiles, not even her good behavior with anybody else. It is all reserved for me. I control who she smiles at, how much she smiles, how much she behaves nicely. And if I cannot control, I'll put an end to her life. By putting an end to her life, there are other ways of showing the fact that I care for her. How do I do it? I convert her into a beautiful painting. Again, I'm saying it's almost like freezing her youth into a work of art. This desire to control. So what? And I engaged a very famous painter to paint her, a well-known painter who's done a very good job as far as the Duke is concerned. And he's recorded the colors, her skin, her throat, her her portrait is most impeccably done, perfectly done. She looks absolutely stunning in the picture. And he was aware of the fact that his wife was very beautiful, very delicately painted. He's almost not almost, he is justifying. He said, look, don't say I'm a bad man. Look at the painting, how beautifully I have got the painting done. How beautiful. I'm not taking away her beauty. I'm not taking away her looks. I'm not letting her die as an old woman, smiling at everybody. But then she had a flaw. Her crime is barely presented as sexual, even though he does admit that other men would draw her blush, but probably it could be very innocent blush. One doesn't know. He also mentions several natural phenomena that inspired her favor. And yet he was driven to murder her by refusal to save her happy glances. Because her refusal to save her happy glances solely, maybe she didn't even do it knowingly. She smiled at him, but she smiled at others. Or she cast happy glances to him, at him, but she did it very innocently to others. She just liked being nice to others, which he couldn't stand. So, this demand for control is also reflected in his relationship with the envoy of another rich family whose daughter he's likely to marry and get a good dowry. The entire poem has a precisely controlled theatrical, and this is a very sinister kind of control. Like, he's almost like a monster. He's a killer. He says that if I cannot control you, I kill you. Or my only way of controlling you is killing you. Because a person with a mentality like this would never be convinced that the wife was actually not smiling at anybody in a flirtatious manner. She was not doing any favors to anybody. She was simply being nice. She was simply being polite. But it upset him to see her smile at anybody else, or being nice to anybody else, or talking to anybody else, or blushing. And he says that she's too easily pleased. In modern day, it would be a ridiculous way to think that just because your wife is smiling at other people, she's unfaithful to you. No, she probably didn't even have it in her head. So the entire poem has a precisely controlled theatrical flair, as I said, very succinct, and that is what makes it very dramatic. From the unveiling of the curtain, the implied gestures that I'll just show you something. Wait there. You will not get any reactions from her or any interactions. And the only interaction I allow is that you have a glance. You're allowed to have a glance at my last touches only when I want it, as much as I want it. So, this demand for control is also reflected in his relationship with the envoy. The entire poem has a precisely controlled theatrical flair. From the unveiling of the curtain that is implied to precede the opening, to the way he slowly reveals the details of his tale, to his assuming of the envoy's interest in the tale. Actually, he might be frightening the envoy away, and so much so that he says that you and I will go down together to the next bride's family and have a word with them. So he does not allow the emissary or the envoy, does not let him go alone, almost from a fear, out of a fear that he might be looking around to have a last glance at the Duchess, the dead Duchess. So wherever you are, I'll be with you. I don't trust you alone. Strangers like you would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there. So we don't really know how much the Duke is allowing the the emissary, how much time he's allowing. He just says, draw a curtain, look at her, very short description, and he mentions Fra Pandolf by design to pique the invoice. He drops names. He says, this painting has now become my possession, just as you see this other sculpture by a famous sculptor. He's showing off his power to control, to possess. That I possess this, I have the power on all this. Later revealing that he believes the opposite to be true. Even at one point, explicitly acknowledging how controlled his story is when he admits that Fra Pandolf, the painter, he drops names. He says that I am a man who understands quality. I am a man who understands class. I am a man who has had so many generations of high class lineage. But she did not understand that. She was too low. Since she was low, she didn't really deserve to live. He's just he's just making himself somebody so much more. He's so full of himself. He's such an entitled person. He makes himself feel, or he's portraying himself as somebody so powerful that he almost exerts a similar control over his story. And there is an ironic disconnect. What is the ironic disconnect? That it's a very impassioned way of saying things, or rather, non passionate way of saying things. There is no emotion in his way, in his speech, which you will see in the dramatic monologue. There's a lot of drama, but there is hardly any emotion. The killing of Porphyria, or the killing of the last Duchess, or the last ride together, it's almost like they are trying to remain, it's an effort to remain cold and detached. That I'm taking a last ride with my beloved, but you see, and at the same time, he talks about so many other things, of achievements, of failures, of having this, of having that, not having that. So what? It's a very cold, not in the case of my last ride together, but in Porphyria's lover and in my last touches, that there's a there's a chilling coldness in the whole thing, in the whole in the whole sentiment mentality of the speaker. It's not a big deal that I've killed Porphyria. It's not a big deal that I have killed off my last duchess. I felt the necessity to do this, so I did it. I felt the necessity to kill Porphyria and eternalize her beautiful moment, so I did it. And the last ride together, he's justifying himself that I don't really need any more, because I have been given, I've been afforded the pleasure of this last ride. And he justifies himself that he cannot keep his beloved, that the woman of his the interest, his love interest, the lady, has rejected him. He says that it's not a big deal, at least I have this moment, because he doesn't go for anything better, which an ordinary person would think, well, why don't you try to keep her forever? There's no need. They might question the duke, well, why didn't you keep her alive? If you think that she was so beautiful, she was worth painting a beautiful picture, why didn't you? Or why did you let Porphyria die? Why did you kill Porphyria? They have their own logic. They have their own reasoning. They have their own rationale. The speakers in the dramatic monologue. In terms of meter, when we are talking about the last touches, Browning represents the Duke's incessant control of story by using a regular meter, but also the enjambment, which is where the phrases do not end at the end of a line. The enjambment works against the otherwise orderly meter, reminding us that the Duke will control his world, including the rhyme scheme of his monologue. I decide, self obsessed. So whatever the Duke does is also, whatever the Duke does is beyond an ordinary man's area of judgment. You do not have the right to judge me, because I'm far too superior to take my own decisions, and I feel that my decisions are justified. To some extent, the Duke's amorality can be understood in terms of aristocracy, because aristocracies can be pretty cold blooded when it comes to control. The poem was originally published with a companion poem under the title of Italy and France, and both attempted to explore the ironies of aristocratic behavior, honor. In this poem, loosely inspired by real events set in Renaissance Italy, the Duke reveals himself not only as a model of culture, but also a monster of morality. His inability to use his moral ugliness, to see his moral ugliness, could be attributed to by having been ruined by worship of a 900 years old name. He says he feels entitled because he has a 900 years old name. Well, I'm really like the institution. What I decide is correct is correct. What I decide is not correct is not correct. He also attributed, he's so entitled that when his wife upset him by too loosely bestowing her favor to others, he refused to speak to her about it. He doesn't even feel the need to discuss this. He doesn't even feel the need that, look, it upsets me, do not do it. Or in a family like ours, we don't do this. There's no need. The wife doesn't even get a chance to explain herself or even to say no, that do not do this to me because I own you. I decide whether you live or die. I am the speaker is almost like he's taken divine law into his own hands. That I play God for you, both for my last duchess as well as for Porphyria's lover. He, they don't really think whether there'll be retribution. They don't really think whether there'll be punishment for what they've done. They just get on with life. He's immortalized his wife in a painting. That's so much better that has happened to you. What were you worth? And the attitude is that I have given you far better honor by killing you and putting you in a painting than by allowing you to flirt with, so to speak, flirt with other men. That is his logic. It's far more honorable to be in a picture frame in a 900-year-old house than to be free and distribute your favors to others. You distribute your favors by being in the painting. Those who I think are worth revealing to, I will reveal your picture to them. Otherwise, you remain hidden. No further conversations on this. And he justifies himself by saying, sorry. He says that who would stoop to blame this kind of trifling? I'm not going to go down to her level to explain things to her or ask her, why did you do this? Those things don't exist in my dictionary. So he will not even stoop to such ordinary domestic tasks as compromise or discussion. There's no scope for discussion. You don't play, I just notice that you're not playing by the rule, so your head rolls. Another element of the aristocratic life that Browning approaches in the poem is that of repetition. The Duke's life seems to be made of repeated gesture. The most obvious is his marriage. Use of the word last in the title implies that there were several others. Probably he's killed off a few more, and they are all curtain covered paintings, the same hallway where this one stands. In the same way that the age of his name gives us credence, so does he seem fit with a life of repeated gestures, one of which he is ready to make again with the Count's daughter. So I just keep marrying, and I hope the next Duchess lives up to my expectations of my 900-year-old aristocratic family standards. If she doesn't, she can be wiped out. She doesn't need to live. And indeed, the question of money is revealed at the end in a way that colors the entire poem. The Duke almost employs his own sense of irony when he brings up a dowry to the envoy. The final stanza suggests that his story of murder is meant to give proactive warning to the woman he's about to marry, to give it a backdoor channel through the envoy who would pass it along the count. This is a message that you mess with me with my 900-year-old family name, this will be your destiny. Through the envoy who would pass it on along with the count, who might then pass it on to the girl. So the girl is always already forewarned that look, if needed, your head will also roll and you will not uh, survive your bad behavior or your untoward behavior. Even as he is clearly stressing the importance of a large dowry tinged with the threat of his vindictive side. And if needed, she will be killed and framed again. If needed, there'll be another one. But the lens of aristocracy undercuts the wonderful psychological nature of the poem, which is overall more concerned with human contradictions than with social or economic criticism. The first contradiction to consider is to how charming, actually the Duke, when he talks, he's got the gift of the gab. He talks beautifully. His expressions, and they are very appealing. Like I said, that we are almost compelled to like him, to empathize with him. And then comes those two or three short phrases that the spines were too much, I gave my commands, and she was killed. So you stay alive in a painting. Keep your smile, but at least I know that you're not smiling at anybody live. So that puts my heart in peace. It would be tempting to suggest Browning wants to paint him as a weasel, but knowing the poet's love of language, it's clear that he wants us to admire the character who can manipulate language so masterfully. Further, the Duke shows an interesting complication in his attitudes on class when he suggests to the inviolate verity. Go together down, an action not expected in such a hierarchical society. By no means we can justify the idea that the Duke is willing to transcend class, but at the same time, he does allow a transgression of the very hierarchy that had previously led him to have his wife murdered. There is also at play the human ability to rationalize our hang ups. The Duke seems controlled by certain forces, his own aristocratic bearing, his relationship to women, and lastly, his particular duchess who confounded him. One can argue that the Duke, who was in love with his last duchess, yes, I loved her. I loved her. But she was also my possession, and my possessions do not flirt around with somebody else. And for him, it's a perceived insult that his wife is flirting with other people. It's a perceived insult to his 9 generations of aristocracy. And then the last aspect is the Duke's language, his use of euphemism, the way he explains that he had the Duchess killed. I gave commands and all spines stopped together. Shows a facility for avoiding the truth through choice of language. And also, what this could suggest is that the Duchess was in fact guilty of greater transgression than he claims. That instead of flirtation, she might have been physically or sexually involved with some people. Nobody knows. It could just be his imagination. But he felt that if she could smile at others in a loving way, I'm sure she could be unfaithful to me in other ways. There's certainly no explicit evidence of this, but at the same time, it's plausible that a man as arrogant as the Duke, especially no one so equipped with the power of euphemism, could avoid spelling out his disgrace to her lowly envoy, and instead would speak around the house. Could be, could well be. Finally, we can also understand this poem as a commentary on art. He doesn't really know a lot about art. The Duke remains enamored with the woman he had killed, though his affection now rests on a representation of her. In other words, he has chosen to love the ideal image of her rather. I mean, he'd much rather be in love with the image than with the real woman because it's easier to control. In many ways, this is the artist's dilemma, which Browning explores in all of his work. As a poet, he attempts to capture contradiction and movement, psychological complexity that cannot be pinned down and one object into one object. And yet, in the end, all he can take is a collection of static lines. So, the Duke attempts to be an artist in his life, turning a walk down the hallway into a performance. It's almost like he comes on stage, he says the imaginary emissary that look, here I reveal to you my last touches. She was very beautiful, but she was flirtatious. Hence I decided, don't worry about it. We'll just get rid of her. But he was always hampered by the fact that the ideal that inspires his performance cannot change. We come to Porphyry's lover and Rossetti tomorrow. We stop here today.